I know I said I only draw football players for the World Cup, but I lost interest. Instead, I spent 14 hours straight making this insane all close-up Kratos drawing, using only a blue ballpoint pen and a mechanical pencil for the sketch. Let's get into it. So to keep this whole piece clean and avoid smudging my own ink, I actually walked completely from left to right across the page. You can see me starting right here on the far left edge of the paper with the wrapped handle of a sword peeking over his shoulder. Once the handle was set, I immediately transitioned into that heavy shoulder armor. This leather armor is an absolutely beast to draw because it had that diamond pattern design. To make it look like an actual weathered leather and not just flat shapes, I had to pack the shadows tightly into the crevice lines while using a feather light touch on the raised areas to catch the light. Now right here is where my process gets a bit interesting. Before I even touched its main facial features, I wanted to anchor the drawing by establishing the deepest shadows. So I started blocking in the dark heavy part of the beard that sits right against the fur collar. Getting that deep value down first gave me a solid baseline for the rest of the piece. Once the darker part was set, I moved upwards to map out the structure of his head. Then after spending a lot of time there, I start shading the low heavy eyebrow. Kratos has an incredibly distinct intense bone structure, so getting the brow bone right is everything. I spent a massive chunk of time right here just carving out the intense lines to make sure these facial expressions came out right. Right alongside the eyebrow, I started working on his iconic scar. The scar is fascinating because it's a lighter value than the rest of his skin, but it has raised textured edges. To achieve that effect with a blue pen up close, I had to cross hatch very lightly around the scar tissue, leaving the actual line of the scar mostly untouched by ink, while deepening the shadows right next to it to create depth. After mapping the tribal mark, I tackled the nose before touching the eyes. Getting the strong angular bridge of his nose shaded correctly was crucial because it sets the symmetry for the rest of his expression. If the nose is slightly off, the eyes won't align and the whole portrait falls apart. And then finally, we get to the eyes. I always say that the eyes can make or break a portrait. With older Kratos, his eyes shouldn't look angry. They need to look incredibly heavy. Now, if you know the reference image I used for this, his right eye actually has a glowing blue magic element and there are all these sparkling embers floating around. But I decided to completely skip the sparkling elements and the flame in his eyes. I wanted this piece to feel totally grounded, raw and gritty, so I kept them intensely human instead. With the eyes locked in, I went back to work on the rest of the face, moving all the way across to detail his cheeks and carving out his right ear on the other side. Now that the full head structure is basically defined, we can finally move back down to the massive job waiting for us below. Alright, time to dive headfirst into the rest of his massive beard. Can we just talk about how intimidating it is to draw a thick beard with a fine point pen? If you just draw straight lines, it looks flat and fake. To make it look like actual hair that has texture and volume, you have to layer your lines continuously over and over again. And ballpoint pens are notorious for building up ink blobs on the very tip. If you aren't paying attention, that ink will transfer onto your paper as a giant dark smudge. I had a piece of scrap paper sitting right next to me and literally every 10 or 15 strokes, I had to wipe the tip of the pen just to keep the ink flow clean. It completely breaks your rhythm, but it's a survival tactic. By hour 9 or 10, your eyes start playing tricks on you, and suddenly you can't tell if the shading is actually good or if your brain has just given up. Quickly drop down to define the lips and the mouth line, hiding right under the heavy mustache. I really want to emphasize how long 14 hours feels when you are locked in a room staring at a macro view of a piece of paper. When you watch a time lapse like this, everything looks so smooth and effortless. It looks like the pen is just magically flying across the paper. But what you guys don't see are the hours where I'm just sitting there in completely silence and watching YouTube videos while I'm doing my drawing. While my back is aching, my neck is stiff. I actually had to split this drawing over 3 days. But honestly, seeing it come together like this in the footage makes every single hand cramp completely worth it. But the very last thing I did, the finishing touch, was going right back to the boundary where the beard meets the fur collar. I carefully added tiny individual hair strands, extending outward from his beard, overlapping them slightly onto the fur to make the transition look completely natural.